Hook, behind the golden gates of Aldermere Palace, where protocol dictates every breath, and scandal lurks in every shadow, a single moment of raw emotion threatens to shatter centuries of royal tradition. When Crown Prince Alexander witnesses what appears to be an attack on his beloved wife, Princess Isabella, the careful facade of nobility crumbles, revealing the fierce protector beneath the crown. What follows is a confrontation that will echo through the marble halls of power, challenging everything the kingdom thought it knew about their future king. The morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculate gardens of Aldermere Palace, as Princess Isabella made her way toward the Rose Pavilion for her scheduled charity meeting. The click of her heels against the stone pathway echoed softly in the crisp autumn air, accompanied only by the distant sound of fountains and the measured footsteps of her protection detail following at a respectful distance. Isabella had grown accustomed to the constant presence of security during her 5 years as a member of the Aldermere royal family.
What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the palace since Queen Regent Margot had assumed more control over royal affairs following the late king's passing 6 months ago. The Queen Regent, Crown Prince Alexander's stepmother, had never made any secret of her disapproval of Isabella's marriage to the heir apparent. Where the late King Edmund had welcomed Isabella warmly into the family, Margot viewed her as an outsider who lacked the proper aristocratic bloodline befitting a future queen. The tension had only intensified since the king's death, with Margot asserting her authority over palace protocols and staff assignments with increasing frequency. As Isabella approached the pavilion, she noticed an unusual commotion near the entrance. Commander Marcus Blackwood, the Queen Regent's personal security chief, stood blocking the doorway with 2 of his men. Blackwood was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall, with graying temples and cold gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had served in various military capacities before joining the royal security detail, and his loyalty to Queen Regent Margot was absolute and unwavering. "Commander Blackwood," Isabella said politely as she approached.
"I have a scheduled meeting with the Children's Foundation representatives this morning. May I pass, please?" Blackwood's expression remained stern and unmoved. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Your Highness.
The Queen Regent has ordered a security review of all pavilion activities. The meeting has been postponed indefinitely."
Isabella felt a familiar flutter of frustration in her chest. This was the 3rd charity event that had been mysteriously cancelled or postponed in recent weeks, always at the last minute and always on Margot's orders. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and Isabella suspected it was part of a deliberate campaign to undermine her public role and influence within the royal family. "I wasn't informed of any postponement," Isabella replied, keeping her voice steady despite her growing anger. "Perhaps there's been some miscommunication. I'd like to speak with the Queen Regent directly about this matter." "Her Majesty is indisposed," Blackwood replied curtly. "She's given strict instructions that the pavilion is to remain secure until further notice. I suggest you return to your quarters, Your Highness." The dismissive tone in his voice was unmistakable, and Isabella felt her cheeks flush with indignation. She had been treated with cool formality since joining the royal family, but this level of open disrespect was new and alarming. The way Blackwood spoke to her, as if she were a child being sent to her room rather than the future Queen of Aldermere, made her blood boil. "Commander, I am the crown princess of this realm," Isabella said, her voice taking on a firmer edge. "I don't believe you have the authority to prevent me from accessing any part of this palace without direct written orders from His Majesty the Crown Prince himself." Blackwood's eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement, though his expression remained stone-faced. "The Crown Prince is away on state business, as you well know. In his absence, the Queen Regent holds full authority over palace security matters. Her orders supersede any previous arrangements." Behind Isabella, she could hear her own security detail shifting uncomfortably. Captain James Morrison, her head of protection, stepped forward slightly, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Morrison was a veteran of the palace guard who had served the royal family for over 15 years, and Isabella could see the conflict playing out across his weathered features as he found himself caught between competing authorities. "Your Highness," Morrison said quietly, "perhaps we should return to the main palace and clarify these new security protocols through proper channels." But Isabella was beyond the point of diplomatic retreat. The constant undermining, the subtle humiliations, the growing sense that she was being systematically isolated from her royal duties, it all came to a head in that moment, as she faced Blackwood's impassive face and barely concealed contempt. "No, Captain Morrison," she said firmly. "I will not be treated like an intruder in my own home. Commander Blackwood, I am going to enter that pavilion for my scheduled meeting. If you wish to prevent me, you'll need to do so physically, which I believe would constitute an assault on a member of the royal family." The standoff that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it likely lasted only seconds.
Blackwood's men shifted nervously, glancing between their commander and the crown princess. Barson's hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup if the situation escalated further. The morning air suddenly felt charged with tension, as if a storm was gathering despite the clear blue sky overhead. It was Blackwood who broke the silence, taking a deliberate step closer to Isabella. His massive frame seemed to loom over her, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unmistakable threat. Your Highness would be wise to remember her place in this palace hierarchy. The Queen Regent's authority is absolute, and those who challenge it often find themselves facing unfortunate consequences. I strongly recommend you reconsider your position before making any rash decisions you might later regret. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Isabella felt her heart racing as the full implication of his statement sank in. This wasn't just about a canceled meeting or security protocols. This was about power, control, and her position within the royal family structure. Blackwood wasn't just following orders. He was delivering a message from Queen Regent Margot herself. In the distance, neither Isabella nor Blackwood noticed the figure of Crown Prince Alexander approaching through the garden paths, having returned early from his diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom of Ravencrest. Alexander had been looking forward to surprising his wife with his early return, hoping to steal a few private moments together before resuming his official duties. As he drew closer to the pavilion, Alexander could see the tense confrontation unfolding, though he couldn't yet hear the words being exchanged. What he could see was his wife standing rigid with what appeared to be barely controlled anger, facing off against Blackwood's imposing figure while several security personnel stood by in obvious discomfort. Alexander quickened his pace, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach as he recognized the unmistakable signs of a serious confrontation. He had learned to read the subtle dynamics of palace politics from childhood, and the scene before him screamed of trouble. The positioning of the guards, the defensive stance of Isabella's security detail, and most concerning of all, the aggressive posture of Blackwood himself. All of it pointed to a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. As Alexander moved closer, he began to catch fragments of the conversation, Blackwood's menacing tone becoming clearer with each step. The Crown Prince felt his own anger beginning to rise as he realized his wife was being threatened by one of his stepmother's loyal enforcers, and the protective instincts that had been ingrained in him since childhood began to override his usual diplomatic restraint. What Alexander witnessed next would change everything. As Isabella attempted to step around Blackwood toward the pavilion entrance, the commander moved to physically block her path, his large hand reaching out toward her arm in what appeared to be preparation to forcibly restrain her. The gesture was unmistakably aggressive, crossing every line of protocol and respect that governed interactions with members of the royal family. In that crystalline moment, as Alexander saw what appeared to be an assault about to occur against his beloved wife, something primal and furious awakened within the future king of Aldermere. The careful diplomatic training, the years of protocol and restraint, the political calculations that usually governed his every action, all of it evaporated in an instant as pure protective rage took control. Alexander broke into a run, his voice cutting across the garden air like a blade as he shouted a warning that would echo through the palace corridors for months to come. The confrontation that was about to unfold would test every relationship, challenge every alliance, and force the royal family to confront truths that had been festering in the shadows since the late king's death. The morning that had begun with such peaceful promise was about to become a defining moment in the history of the Aldermere monarchy, setting in motion events that would reshape the very foundation of power within the palace walls. "Get your hands off my wife!" Alexander's roar echoed across the garden with such ferocity that birds scattered from nearby trees and several palace staff members who had been tending to the grounds immediately froze in their work. The Crown Prince's voice carried a raw authority that seemed to shake the very stones of the ancient pavilion, transforming the peaceful morning into something electric and dangerous. Commander Blackwood spun around at the sound, his hand dropping away from Isabella as if burned. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, the imposing security chief looked genuinely startled, his usual mask of cold control slipping to reveal something approaching concern. He had not expected the Crown Prince to return from his diplomatic mission for another 2 days, and the timing of Alexander's arrival could not have been worse. Alexander covered the remaining distance to the pavilion in long, powerful strides, his athletic frame radiating barely contained fury. His dark hair was disheveled from travel, and his formal diplomatic attire was wrinkled from the journey. But none of that mattered in the face of the protective rage that had consumed him. His blue eyes, normally warm and thoughtful, now blazed with an intensity that made several of the surrounding guards instinctively step backward. "Your Majesty," Blackwood began, attempting to regain his composure and salvage the situation. I was merely following the Queen Regent's security protocols regarding access to the pavilion facilities.
There seems to have been some misunderstanding.
Misunderstanding?
Alexander cut him off with a voice like thunder.
I saw you reach for my wife, Blackwood.
I saw you threaten her. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault on a member of the royal family, and if you were anyone else, you'd already be in chains.
Isabella felt a mixture of relief and concern wash over her as she watched her husband's barely controlled fury. She had seen Alexander angry before, but never like this. Never with the kind of primal protective rage that seemed to strip away every layer of royal diplomacy and political calculation.
This was the man beneath the crown, and he was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Alexander, she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm.
I'm all right. Nothing actually happened. But Alexander's attention remained fixed on Blackwood. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. The Crown Prince had spent years learning to navigate the complex web of palace politics, to find diplomatic solutions to every conflict, to maintain the careful balance of power that kept the monarchy stable. But all of that careful training meant nothing when faced with a direct threat to the woman he loved more than life itself.
Commander Blackwood, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that was somehow more menacing than his earlier shout.
You will explain to me right now why you felt it was appropriate to threaten the Crown Princess of Aldermere. You will explain why you were prepared to lay hands on my wife.
And you will do it quickly, before I forget that I am a civilized man and not the warrior kings my ancestors were.
The historical reference was not lost on anyone present.
The early kings of Aldermere had been known for their fierce protection of their families and their tendency to settle disputes with sword and strength rather than words and diplomacy. The current royal family had long prided itself on evolving beyond such primitive approaches to conflict resolution, but in that moment, Alexander seemed to be channeling every drop of his ancestors' blood.
Blackwood straightened to his full height, clearly attempting to reassert his authority despite the precariousness of his position. His years of military training and absolute loyalty to Queen Regent Margot warred with his basic survival instinct, which was screaming at him to defuse the situation before it escalated beyond his control.
Your Majesty, he said carefully, the Queen Regent issued specific instructions regarding security protocols for all pavilion activities following recent intelligence about potential threats to royal family members. Princess Isabella was informed that her meeting needed to be postponed for security reasons. When she refused to comply with these safety measures, I was forced to take a firmer stance to protect her from potential danger. The explanation sounded rehearsed and hollow, and Alexander's expression grew even darker as he processed Blackwood's words.
The Crown Prince was intimately familiar with palace security protocols, having been briefed on them regularly since childhood, and he knew that no such intelligence about pavilion threats had crossed his desk before his departure for Ravencrest.
What intelligence?
Alexander demanded.
What specific threats? From what source? When were these threats identified, and why wasn't I informed before my departure if they were credible enough to require such drastic security measures? Captain Morrison, Isabella's head of security, stepped forward slightly, his discomfort with the entire situation evident in his posture. Morrison had been present for the entire confrontation and had witnessed Blackwood's threatening behavior firsthand. One of the biggest and generals of his loyalty was to the Crown Princess first and the Crown Prince second, but he also understood the dangerous position he found himself in as tensions escalated between different factions within the palace guard. Your Majesty, Morrison said carefully, I was not briefed on any new intelligence regarding pavilion security. The first I heard of any changes to security protocols was when Commander Blackwood arrived this morning with orders to prevent access to the pavilion. Alexander's gaze shifted to Morrison briefly, noting the careful way his wife's security chief was choosing his words.
Morrison was a good man and a loyal servant of the crown, but he was also smart enough to understand that this confrontation was about much more than security protocols or canceled meetings. This was about power, control, and the ongoing struggle between different factions within the royal household.
Commander Blackwood, Alexander said, turning his attention back to the Queen Regent's security chief. You have served this family for several years, and I have always respected your dedication to duty. But your duty does not extend to threatening members of the royal family based on fabricated security concerns.
Your duty does not include blocking the Crown Princess from her legitimate royal activities without proper authorization. Blackwood's jaw tightened at the accusation, but he maintained his rigid military bearing.
I serve at the pleasure of the Queen Regent, Your Majesty. My orders come directly from her, and I follow them without question. If you take issue with those orders, perhaps you should discuss the matter with Her Majesty directly. The subtle challenge in Blackwood's response was unmistakable, and Alexander felt his anger flare even hotter. The security chief was essentially telling the future king to take his complaints to his stepmother, dismissing Alexander's authority in favor of Margot's current position as queen regent. It was a calculated insult wrapped in the language of protocol, and it revealed just how far the power dynamics within the palace had shifted during Alexander's brief absence. Isabella watched the exchange with growing alarm, recognizing that the confrontation was rapidly moving beyond a simple disagreement about security protocols.
This was becoming a direct challenge to Alexander's authority as crown prince and heir to the throne, played out in front of multiple witnesses who would undoubtedly carry word of it throughout the palace within hours.
"Alexander," she said again, more urgently this time.
Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately, away from the garden where anyone might overhear. But Alexander was beyond such diplomatic considerations. The sight of Blackwood's hand reaching toward his wife, the memory of the threatening tone he had heard in the man's voice, the casual dismissal of his own authority, all of it had combined to create a perfect storm of protective fury that would not be easily contained or redirected.
"No, Isabella," Alexander said firmly, never taking his eyes off Blackwood. "This ends here and now."
I will not have members of my household staff treating you with disrespect or threatening you with physical restraint. I will not have my stepmother's enforcers undermining your legitimate royal duties based on fabricated security concerns."
The mention of Queen Regent Margot sent a visible tremor through the assembled guards and staff. Everyone present understood that the real conflict was between Alexander and his stepmother, with Blackwood serving as Margot's proxy in this particular battle.
The question now was whether the crown prince would allow himself to be drawn into open confrontation with the queen regent through her security chief, or whether cooler heads would prevail. Blackwood seemed to sense that he had pushed the situation as far as he dared, but his absolute loyalty to Margot and his own stubborn nature prevented him from backing down completely. Instead, he chose to double down on his position, making what would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation about how far he could push the crown prince without facing serious consequences. "Your Majesty," Blackwood said with barely concealed insolence, "the Queen Regent's authority in security matters is absolute during your absence from the palace."
If Princess Isabella had simply followed proper protocols and returned to her quarters as instructed, this entire unpleasant scene could have been avoided. Perhaps in the future, all family members might benefit from a clearer understanding of the chain of command during periods of royal transition.
The insult was so blatant, so deliberately provocative, that several of the assembled guards actually gasped audibly. Captain Morrison took an unconscious step backward, recognizing that Blackwood had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Isabella felt her own anger flare at the suggestion that she had somehow been at fault for refusing to accept being bullied by palace security. But it was Alexander's reaction that would be remembered and discussed in palace corridors for years to come. The crown prince, heir to a throne that had been held by his family for over 4 centuries, future king of a proud and ancient realm, looked at Commander Blackwood with the kind of cold fury that had once sent entire armies fleeing in terror from the battlefield. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and promised consequences that would reshape the very foundation of power within the palace walls.
"Commander Blackwood," Alexander said with deadly quiet, "you have just made the gravest error of your professional career." The crown prince's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread outward to encompass every person within earshot. The assembled guards, staff members, and security personnel suddenly found themselves witnesses to what was rapidly becoming a defining moment in recent royal history, the kind of confrontation that would be whispered about in palace corridors for decades to come.
Alexander took a deliberate step closer to Blackwood, his imposing frame radiating the kind of controlled power that came from years of military training and the absolute confidence of birthright. Despite being slightly shorter than the security commander, the crown prince's presence seemed to fill the space around them, making Blackwood appear smaller and less commanding by comparison.
"You have threatened my wife," Alexander continued, his voice gaining intensity with each word. "You have insulted the crown princess of Aldermere. You have fabricated security concerns to undermine her legitimate royal duties. And now you have had the unmitigated audacity to suggest that she should have simply accepted your illegal and inappropriate behavior without question." Isabella watched her husband with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that Alexander had reached a point of no return in his confrontation with Blackwood. She had seen him angry before, but never with this level of barely contained fury that seemed to crackle in the air around him like electricity. This was the protective instinct of a man defending his family, amplified by the absolute authority of a future king who would tolerate no challenge to those he loved. Captain Morrison stood at rigid attention,
his experienced eyes constantly scanning the surrounding area for signs of additional security personnel who might be drawn to the commotion. Morrison understood better than most that this confrontation would have far-reaching consequences throughout the palace hierarchy, and he was already mentally preparing for the political fallout that would inevitably follow. Blackwood, to his credit, maintained his military bearing despite the increasingly dangerous situation he found himself in. Years of service in hostile environments had taught him to project confidence even when facing superior force, and his absolute loyalty to Queen Regent Margot gave him the courage to continue his defiant stance even as warning bells rang in his survival instincts. "Your Majesty," Blackwood said with forced calm, "I have served this family faithfully for over 6 years. I have never acted outside the bounds of my authority, or in contradiction to the orders I have received from legitimate sources. If you believe my actions today were inappropriate, I respectfully suggest that your grievance lies not with me, but with the Queen Regent who issued the orders I was bound by duty to follow." The deflection was smoothly delivered, but it only served to further inflame Alexander's anger. The Crown Prince recognized the tactic for what it was, an attempt to shift responsibility away from Blackwood's personal actions and onto the broader political conflict between Alexander and his stepmother. It was also a subtle reminder that Margot currently held significant power within the palace hierarchy, and that challenging her authority through her agents might have unintended consequences. "Don't hide behind the Queen Regent's authority," Alexander snapped, his diplomatic composure finally cracking completely. "Your orders may have come from her, but your behavior toward my wife was your choice. Your threatening tone, your intimidating posture, your clear preparation to physically restrain the Crown Princess, none of that was required by any security protocol, fabricated or otherwise." Alexander turned slightly to address Captain Morrison without taking his eyes off Blackwood. "Captain, I want you to document everything you witnessed here today. Every word, every gesture, every threat made against Princess Isabella. I want a full report on my desk within the hour, and I want copies sent to the Palace Guard Commander and the Royal Household Secretary." "Yes, Your Majesty," Morrison replied crisply, relief evident in his voice as he received clear orders that would help protect him from potential retaliation while ensuring that the incident was properly recorded through official channels. The request for documentation sent a visible tremor through Blackwood's carefully maintained composure. Official reports would create a paper trail that could not be easily dismissed or explained away, and they would force Queen Regent Margot to either publicly defend her security chief's actions or abandon him to face the consequences alone. Isabella stepped closer to her husband, placing a gentle hand on his arm in an attempt to provide some calming influence on his barely controlled fury. She could feel the tension radiating from his frame like heat, and she understood that Alexander was moments away from taking action that might have serious political ramifications throughout the kingdom.
"Alexander," she said softly, "perhaps we should—" But her words were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps as additional palace security personnel began arriving on the scene. Word of the confrontation had clearly spread through the palace communication networks, and both supporters of the Crown Prince and agents loyal to Queen Regent Margot were converging on the pavilion area.
The first to arrive was Colonel James Hartwell, the overall commander of the Palace Guard, and a man who had served the royal family with distinction for over 20 years. Hartwell was a career military officer who prided himself on remaining above palace politics while maintaining absolute loyalty to the crown itself, rather than any individual faction within the royal household. "Your Majesty," Hartwell said as he approached, his trained eyes quickly assessing the tense situation and the positions of all involved parties. "I received reports of a security incident in the garden area. How may I assist?" Alexander turned to face the Palace Guard commander, and Hartwell immediately recognized the signs of barely controlled fury in the Crown Prince's demeanor. Years of service had taught him to read the subtle cues that indicated when members of the royal family were approaching their breaking point, and everything about Alexander's posture screamed danger. "Colonel Hartwell," Alexander said with forced calm, "Commander Blackwood has just threatened the Crown Princess and prevented her from accessing the pavilion for her scheduled charity meeting. When questioned about his authority to take such action, he became belligerent and suggested that Princess Isabella should have simply accepted his inappropriate behavior without question." Hartwell's expression remained carefully neutral as he processed this information, but Isabella could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested concern. The Palace Guard commander understood better than most that conflicts between different security factions could quickly escalate into larger political crises if not handled with extreme care. "I see," Hartwell said diplomatically. "Commander Blackwood, perhaps you could brief me on the security concerns that prompted these protective measures." Blackwood straightened to full attention, clearly grateful for the opportunity to present his version of events to someone who might be more sympathetic to his position than the furious Crown Prince. Sir, the Queen Regent issued specific orders this morning regarding pavilion security following intelligence about potential threats to royal family members.
When Princess Isabella attempted to access the restricted area despite these safety measures, I was forced to take appropriate action to ensure her protection. The Crown Prince's arrival seems to have created some confusion about the proper chain of command in his absence.
The carefully worded response was designed to make Blackwood appear as a dedicated security professional simply following orders, while subtly suggesting that Alexander was overreacting to routine protective measures. It was also another subtle reminder that Queen Regent Margot currently held authority over palace security matters during the Crown Prince's official absences.
Colonel Hartwell nodded thoughtfully, clearly aware that he was being asked to navigate between competing authorities within the royal household. His next words would either help diffuse the situation or potentially escalate it into a full-blown crisis that could have ramifications throughout the kingdom.
Commander Blackwood, Hartwell said carefully, I was not briefed on any new intelligence regarding pavilion security. Could you provide me with the source and specifics of these threat assessments so that I can coordinate appropriate protective measures with the overall security plan? The question was diplomatically phrased, but its implication was clear. As the overall commander of palace security, Hartwell should have been informed of any credible threats that required changes to established protocols. His lack of knowledge about these supposed security concerns effectively called Blackwood's explanation into question without directly accusing him of fabricating the entire situation. Blackwood's jaw tightened as he realized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable.
The arrival of Colonel Hartwell had not provided the support he had hoped for, and the Palace Guard commander's questions were effectively exposing the weakness of his justifications for the confrontation with Isabella. The intelligence came directly from the Queen Regent's private security briefing, Blackwood said stiffly.
The specific details are classified above my clearance level, but her orders regarding pavilion access were explicit and non-negotiable. Alexander stepped forward again, his anger reigniting at what he recognized as yet another deflection and excuse.
Enough, he said with royal authority that seemed to resonate through the very stones of the palace. Colonel Hartwell, I want Commander Blackwood removed from duty pending a full investigation into his conduct today. I want the Queen Regent informed that her security chief threatened the Crown Princess and will face appropriate consequences for his actions. The direct order hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to choose sides in what was rapidly becoming an open power struggle between the Crown Prince and the Queen Regent.
Colonel Hartwell found himself in the impossible position of having to decide whether to follow Alexander's orders or risk defending Blackwood's actions and potentially challenging the future king's authority. What happened next would determine not only Blackwood's fate, but the entire balance of power within the palace hierarchy.
Colonel Hartwell stood at the center of the confrontation, his weathered features betraying none of the internal conflict he faced. 20 years of service to the royal family had taught him that moments like these could define careers, reshape alliances, and determine the future direction of the monarchy itself.
The wrong decision now could have consequences that would echo through the palace halls for years to come. Your Majesty, Hartwell said carefully, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man who understood the gravity of the situation. Removing Commander Blackwood from duty is certainly within your authority. However, such action might be better coordinated with the Queen Regent's office to ensure proper continuity of security protocols during the transition. The diplomatic response was designed to acknowledge Alexander's authority while avoiding an immediate confrontation with Queen Regent Margot's faction. It was the kind of careful political maneuvering that had kept Hartwell in his position through multiple changes in palace leadership, but Alexander was in no mood for bureaucratic delays. Colonel, Alexander said with dangerous quiet, I am not requesting your opinion on palace politics. I am giving you a direct order regarding a security officer who threatened my wife. Commander Blackwood will be suspended immediately, and you will ensure that he is escorted from the premises pending a full investigation. The Crown Prince's words carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority, and Hartwell recognized that he had reached a point where continued diplomacy might be interpreted as defiance of royal command. The palace guard commander nodded sharply, his military training overriding his political instincts as he prepared to carry out the order. Yes, Your Majesty, Hartwell replied crisply. Lieutenant Morrison, please escort Commander Blackwood to the security office for debriefing. Commander Blackwood, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Please surrender your security credentials and any palace access devices. Blackwood's face flushed red with anger and humiliation as he realized that his gamble had failed catastrophically. His absolute loyalty to Queen Regent Margot had led him to underestimate the Crown Prince's willingness to take direct action,
and now he found himself facing the professional consequences of that miscalculation.
This is outrageous, Blackwood protested, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. I was following direct orders from the Queen Regent herself.
You cannot simply dismiss me for carrying out my legitimate duties as assigned by proper authority. Alexander stepped closer to the disgraced security chief, his blue eyes blazing with renewed fury at Blackwood's continued defiance even in the face of direct royal command. Your legitimate duties do not include threatening members of the royal family, Alexander said with deadly precision. Your orders from the Queen Regent, whatever they may have been, do not authorize you to intimidate my wife or block her access to palace facilities without credible security justification.
Isabella watched the confrontation with a mixture of satisfaction and concern.
While she was gratified to see her husband defending her so fiercely, she also understood that this public humiliation of one of Margot's key supporters would inevitably lead to escalation of the broader conflict between Alexander and his stepmother. Captain Morrison stepped forward to carry out the escort order, but Blackwood made no move to cooperate with his removal.
Instead, the security commander stood his ground with the stubborn determination of a man who believed he was fighting for principles larger than his own career. Your Majesty, Blackwood said with barely controlled anger, you are making a serious error.
The Queen Regent's authority in security matters is absolute during your absence from the palace. By undermining that authority, you are setting a dangerous precedent that could compromise the safety of the entire royal family.
The words were calculated to plant seeds of doubt about Alexander's judgment, while positioning Blackwood as a loyal servant concerned only with royal security. It was also a subtle threat about the potential consequences of challenging Queen Regent Margot's power base within the palace hierarchy. Alexander's reaction was swift and decisive. The Crown Prince closed the remaining distance to Blackwood in 2 quick strides, bringing himself within arm's reach of the security commander. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold fury that had once made his ancestors legendary on ancient battlefields. Commander Blackwood, Alexander said with lethal quiet, you have just compounded your earlier offenses with a direct threat against the royal family's security.
You have suggested that removing you from duty will somehow endanger the people you were sworn to protect. That borders on treasonous implication, and if you continue down this path, you will find yourself facing far more serious consequences than simple suspension.
The threat was unmistakable, and even Blackwood's military courage wavered in the face of such direct royal wrath. Charges of treason against the crown carried severe penalties, and the security commander finally began to realize that his position had become completely untenable.
Colonel Hartwell stepped forward, recognizing that the situation was spiraling toward a level of confrontation that could have serious legal and political ramifications throughout the kingdom. Your Majesty, Hartwell interjected firmly, perhaps it would be best to allow the investigation to proceed through proper channels.
Commander Blackwood, you will come with me now for formal debriefing. Any further discussion of today's events should wait until all parties have had time to review the facts thoroughly. The intervention provided both sides with an opportunity to step back from the brink of a confrontation that could have explosive consequences. Alexander recognized the wisdom in Hartwell's suggestion, even though his protective instincts screamed for immediate and decisive action against anyone who had threatened his wife. Blackwood also seemed to understand that continued resistance would only make his situation worse. The security commander straightened to full military attention and spoke with the rigid formality of a man accepting defeat, while trying to preserve what remained of his dignity.
Yes, sir, Blackwood said to Hartwell. I will cooperate fully with any investigation, and I am confident that my actions will be found to have been entirely appropriate and within the scope of my legitimate authority.
As Hartwell and Morrison escorted the disgraced security commander away from the pavilion, Alexander felt some of the tension begin to drain from his frame. The immediate threat to Isabella had been neutralized, and Blackwood would face appropriate consequences for his inappropriate behavior.
However, the Crown Prince also understood that this confrontation was merely the opening battle in what would likely become a much larger conflict with Queen Regent Margot. Isabella stepped closer to her husband, placing her hand on his arm and feeling the gradual relaxation of his rigid muscles as the crisis began to resolve.
Thank you, she said softly, her voice carrying deep gratitude for his fierce protection. I know this will cause problems with your stepmother, but I couldn't simply allow Blackwood to bully me into submission.
Alexander turned to face his wife, his expression softening as he focused on her rather than the political implications of what had just occurred. In that moment, he was reminded of why he had fought so fiercely, not for royal prerogatives or palace politics, but for the woman he loved more than anything else in the world.
You never have to apologize for standing up for yourself, Alexander said firmly. And you never have to worry about Margot or her supporters intimidating you while I'm alive to prevent it. Whatever consequences come from today, we'll face them together. The promise carried weight that went beyond the immediate crisis,
representing Alexander's commitment to protecting his wife from all threats, whether they came from outside the kingdom or from within the palace itself. It was also a declaration that he would not allow political considerations to override his fundamental duty as a husband and protector. However, even as Alexander and Isabella shared this moment of connection and mutual support, both understood that the real confrontation was yet to come. Queen Regent Margot would not allow the public humiliation of her security chief to go unanswered, and the power struggle that had been simmering beneath the surface of palace politics was about to explode into open conflict. In the distance, palace staff members who had witnessed the confrontation were already spreading word throughout the royal household. By evening, every servant, guard, and administrator would know that the crown prince had directly challenged the queen regent's authority by removing her security chief from duty.
Battle lines were being drawn, and everyone would be forced to choose sides in the coming conflict. As Alexander and Isabella walked back toward the main palace together, neither could have imagined the full scope of the storm that was about to break over their heads.
Queen Regent Margot was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and her response to this challenge would test every relationship, every loyalty, and every assumption about power within the ancient walls of Aldermere Palace. The great oak doors of Queen Regent Margot's private study slammed shut with such force that the sound echoed through the adjacent corridors like a gunshot.
The Queen Regent herself stood in the center of the opulent room, her elegant features twisted with a fury that seemed to radiate from her very core like heat from a forge. The carefully controlled mask of royal propriety that she normally wore had been completely stripped away, revealing the calculating and ruthless woman who lurked beneath the sophisticated exterior.
Word of Commander Blackwood's suspension had reached her within minutes of his escort from the pavilion, carried by loyal servants who understood that their mistress needed to be informed of such developments immediately. What followed was an explosion of rage that sent two ladies-in-waiting fleeing from the room and left the Queen Regent's personal secretary cowering behind her desk, while Margot paced the Persian carpet like a caged lioness. That arrogant boy, Margot seethed, her voice dripping with venom as she contemplated the Crown Prince's direct challenge to her authority.
He thinks because he carries his father's blood that he can simply sweep aside years of carefully constructed order and replace it with his own juvenile understanding of leadership. Lady Catherine Pemberton, Margot's most trusted advisor and oldest friend, sat in one of the leather chairs near the massive fireplace watching her mistress's fury, with the calm detachment of someone who had witnessed such storms many times before. Catherine had served as Margot's confidant since their youth, and she understood better than anyone the depths of ambition and resentment that drove the Queen Regent's actions. "Your Majesty," Catherine said with carefully measured calm, "perhaps this setback can be turned to our advantage." The Crown Prince's actions today were quite public, witnessed by numerous palace staff and security personnel. His behavior could be characterized as impulsive and lacking the kind of measured judgment necessary for effective leadership. Margot paused in her pacing, her sharp green eyes focusing on Catherine with the kind of predatory interest that indicated her political instincts were beginning to override her emotional reaction. The Queen Regent had not achieved her current position through mere marriage to the late king. She had fought for every scrap of power and influence through years of careful manipulation and strategic thinking. "Continue," Margot said tersely, moving to stand behind her ornate desk where she could look out through the tall windows at the palace gardens, where the morning's confrontation had taken place. "Alexander's public humiliation of Commander Blackwood reveals several weaknesses we can exploit." Catherine continued, warming to her theme as she outlined the political opportunities created by the Crown Prince's actions. "First, his inability to control his temper when it comes to his wife suggests he may be unsuited for the kind of diplomatic finesse required in international relations. Second, his willingness to override established security protocols based on personal grievance shows poor judgment that could endanger the royal family. Third, his direct challenge to your authority demonstrates a concerning disregard for proper hierarchy and chain of command." Margot nodded slowly as she processed Catherine's analysis, her fury gradually transforming into the cold calculation that made her such a formidable political opponent. The Queen Regent understood that emotional reactions, while satisfying in the moment, rarely produce the kind of long-term strategic advantages that could reshape the balance of power within the kingdom. "The Privy Council meets tomorrow," Margot mused, her mind already working through the possibilities for leveraging the day's events into broader political advantage. Several members have expressed private concerns about Alexander's readiness for the throne, particularly his tendency to prioritize personal relationships over state interests. Catherine leaned forward slightly, recognizing the direction of her mistress's thoughts and preparing to help develop the strategy that would emerge from this crisis. "Lord Chancellor Pembroke has been particularly vocal about the need for strong leadership during these uncertain times," Catherine observed. The recent tensions with neighboring kingdoms require the kind of experienced hand that comes only from years of careful diplomatic work. Perhaps it's time to discuss whether the crown would benefit from an extended regency period. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon, representing the kind of bold political maneuver that could either secure Margot's power for years to come or destroy her completely if it failed. An extended regency would essentially maintain her current authority indefinitely while relegating Alexander to a ceremonial role until she deemed him ready for true leadership, a determination she would be in no hurry to make. Margot turned from the window to face Catherine directly, her expression showing the kind of ruthless determination that had carried her from minor nobility to the heights of royal power. "Draft a memorandum to the Privy Council," she ordered with crisp authority. "I want a full review of today's security incident, with particular emphasis on the Crown Prince's decision to override established protocols based on personal considerations. Frame it as a matter of national security and royal family safety." Catherine nodded eagerly, already envisioning the political storm that such a memorandum would create among the kingdom's most powerful nobles and advisors. The Privy Council wielded significant influence over royal succession and governance issues, and their support could legitimize virtually any course of action Margot chose to pursue. Meanwhile, in their private apartments on the opposite side of the palace, Alexander and Isabella were dealing with the aftermath of the morning's confrontation in their own way. The Crown Prince sat in his favorite chair near the fireplace, still wearing his travel-wrinkled diplomatic attire as he stared into the flames with the kind of intense focus that suggested deep thought and planning. Isabella had changed into a simple day dress and was pacing near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, her earlier anger replaced by growing concern about the political consequences of Alexander's protective actions. She understood her husband's motivations completely and felt deep gratitude for his fierce defense, but she also recognized that they had likely triggered a response from Margot that could threaten everything they held dear. "She won't let this stand," Isabella said quietly, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled over the room. "Margot has worked too hard to build her power base to allow it to be challenged so publicly without striking back." Alexander looked up from the fire, his blue eyes reflecting both determination and concern as he processed his wife's observation. The Crown Prince understood palace politics as well as anyone, and he knew that Isabella's assessment was entirely accurate. Margot would view today's events as a direct declaration of war, and her response would be swift, decisive, and potentially devastating. "I know," Alexander replied simply, "but I couldn't stand by and watch that bastard threaten you. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The simple statement carried profound weight, representing not just Alexander's personal commitment to his wife, but his fundamental approach to leadership and responsibility. The Crown Prince had chosen to prioritize protection of his family over political considerations, and he was prepared to accept whatever consequences that choice might bring. A soft knock at the door interrupted their private conversation, and Captain Morrison entered at Alexander's invitation. The security chief's expression was grave as he approached, carrying a sealed envelope that bore the official crest of the palace guard. "Your Majesty," Morrison said formally, "Colonel Hartwell asked me to deliver this report immediately. He said you would want to review it before the evening briefing." Alexander took the envelope and broke the wax seal, his expression growing increasingly dark as he read the contents of Hartwell's preliminary investigation report. When he finished, he looked up at Isabella and Morrison with the kind of grim expression that suggested the situation was even more serious than they had realized. "What is it?" Isabella asked, moving closer to her husband as concern replaced the relative calm she had been feeling. "Hartwell's investigation has uncovered some disturbing information," Alexander said grimly. "Blackwood's orders this morning didn't come through normal security channels. They were delivered by private messenger, directly from Margot's personal staff, bypassing all established protocols for threat assessment and response coordination." The implication was clear and deeply troubling. If Margot had deliberately circumvented normal security procedures to issue orders that resulted in the confrontation with Isabella, it suggested a level of premeditation and political calculation that went far beyond routine power struggles. "There's more," Alexander continued, his voice taking on an edge of barely controlled anger. 3 other incidents in recent weeks involving cancelled or disrupted activities for Isabella can be traced to similar private orders from the Queen Regent's office. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign to undermine Isabella's public role and influence. The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow, confirming her worst suspicions about the increasing isolation and frustration she had been experiencing. Margot hadn't simply been exercising her authority as Queen Regent, she had been deliberately sabotaging Isabella's ability to fulfill her royal duties and maintain her public profile. "We have to take this to the Privy Council," Isabella said firmly, her earlier concern replaced by righteous anger at the scope of Margot's manipulations. If she's been systematically undermining my royal duties, that goes far beyond normal political disagreements. Alexander nodded grimly, understanding that they had reached a point where private resolution of their conflict with Margot was no longer possible. The Queen Regent had escalated the situation to a level that required formal intervention from the kingdom's highest governmental authorities. However, even as Alexander and Isabella prepared for the battle to come, neither could have anticipated the full scope of Margot's counterstrike. The Queen Regent was not merely defending her current position. She was preparing to seize permanent control of the crown itself, using the day's events as justification for actions that would reshape the very foundation of the Aldermere monarchy. As night fell over the ancient palace, two opposing forces prepared for a conflict that would determine not only the immediate balance of power within the royal household, but the future direction of the entire kingdom. The confrontation that had begun with a simple charity meeting was about to explode into a crisis that would test every loyalty, challenge every assumption, and force the people of Aldermere to choose between competing visions of leadership and justice. The battle for the crown was about to begin, and neither side would emerge unchanged from the storm that was coming. Royal fury unleashed. William lunges at Camilla's guard, protecting Kate.